Good morning and good afternoon, good evening if we have any overseas listeners with us today. And welcome to day 3 of Net Zero Week, the UK's official awareness week and the biggest online net zero conference. Many thanks to our sponsors of the week, Beyondly, Hitachi Zero Carbon, Manpower, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Ramboll for their support for the week. Today, we're focusing on a very important area when it comes to net zero and sustainability, and that's places. We all live in them, many of us work in them, and they're absolutely crucial to the whole net zero conversation. We've got some very interesting discussions also during this overall session on climate action and retrofitting and also the urban landscape challenge and how crucially we finance net zero. A reminder that, as always, during all of our sessions, our audience has the opportunity to ask questions or make brief points using the questions box that you'll see in front of you on the screen. The exact position of that box will depend upon what device you are accessing today's event on. My name's Andy Walker. I'm a construction journalist and one of the contributors to Climate Perspectives magazine, which reports extensively on net zero and sustainability issues. So our first session of today is a session entitled Driving Towards Net Zero, Innovations in Climate Action and Retrofitting Initiatives. And we've got a number of people who are with us this morning who are going to talk about some of their strategies for accelerating in the areas of climate action and retrofitting. We have Lucy Allis from York and North Yorkshire Combined Authority, who are going to showcase their place-based approach and particularly highlighting their Routemap to carbon negative. We have Jocelyne Fleming from the Chartered Institute of Building in Scotland, who's going to reveal some interesting insights from their recent report on retrofitting social housing. And we've also got Antoine Pellet from the from the social housing charity HACT, HACT, and he's going to talk about the RetrofitCredits scheme, which is an innovative initiative which boosts funding for the housing sector. Without further ado, we'll move to our first speaker, which, as I said before, is Lucy Allis, who is Local Authorities Climate Action Coordinator for York and North Yorkshire Combined Authority. Lucy works collaboratively with local authorities, national parks and other partners in a range of areas of net zero, including delivery of York and North Yorkshire's Routemap to carbon negative, which is building retrofit and community climate action. Lucy, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Andy. And yeah, hello, everyone. So the document that Andy was talking about there, our Routemap to carbon negative, is sort of the big thing that we have in York and North Yorkshire in terms of net zero on behalf of the Combined Authority. So that was delivered in 2022 and sort of showcased to everyone, and we're looking to refresh it later on this year. But that covers all the different areas of net zero, including the heat and buildings, power, transport, businesses, all those kinds of things, and essentially lays out how we will get to net zero by 2034 and carbon negative by 2040. And on the theme of place, one of the things that's really important for us is that, because if you know North Yorkshire, you'll know it's very rural, and we have a lot of that rural landscape, and then we have York as well, that we have a unique opportunity to go to carbon negative because of the natural capital that we have. So the Routemap is very tapped into that theme of place, and there's a line in it acknowledging that we want the right interventions in the right place, because it is so diverse in terms of like building stock and businesses and things like that. So that's sort of the main document. For those that don't know, we also have recently become a combined authority. So we got our mayor, David Scaife, in May. So obviously we have an opportunity again through devolution and some of that more direct line with government as well, again, to really drive forward that place-based approach, and hopefully get more funding and powers through the devolution process. One of the big areas of my work is retrofit, and that is one of the things that we're approaching again in quite a place-based way. As a lot of locations do, we're looking to get a one-stop shop for retrofit. So if you're a consumer, one place that you can go and say, I want to retrofit my house, and then you get taken through that process end to end. So that's another thing that I'll probably end up mentioning in the conversation. We've got a couple of projects that are trying to tackle that on our patch in slightly different ways, and looking at different aspects of it, whether it is looking at that end-to-end process for the consumer, whether it's looking more at the advice, the training to support the supply chain, all that kind of thing. But again, unique to us, and acknowledging that our housing stock is quite old, that a lot of it is off gas, that we have a lot of conservation areas and things like that, and that the people in York and North Yorkshire will be different to the people everywhere else. So yeah, those are the sort of main things in terms of a place-based approach that we have.
Thanks very much, Lucy. We'll certainly come back on a number of those issues that you mentioned there. It's great that we've actually got someone from a combined authority in the room with us today, because yesterday we had some interesting discussions on a whole series of issues, and one of the things that came out was the role of combined authorities, particularly the role of mayors as well in on all of this process as well. So it'll be interesting to explore some of those issues next as well. Our next speaker is Jocelyne Fleming, who is a Policy and Public Affairs Officer for the Chartered Institute of Building in Scotland. She leads the organisation's work advocating in the public interest on all issues related to the built environment and construction, with a range of policymakers and stakeholders across Scotland. Her recent work has focused on cladding remediation, building safety and maintenance, retrofit, and also addressing the skills shortages in the construction sector. So, Jocelyne, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much for having me. Last year, I had the very good fortune of working with some of the housing associations in Scotland on a piece of research which has now been published and is called Harnessing Scotland's Social Housing Expertise. Primarily, that research aimed to identify current challenges to the wide-scale retrofit of social housing and make recommendations to Scottish Government for tangible policy change to help resolve some of those barriers. Housing associations are not only directly linked to the Scottish Government's goal to end homelessness, but with well over 250,000 units across the nation, they're also key partners in achieving decarbonisation and net zero targets. So the biggest challenges that came out of the roundtable discussions were related to funding, which is probably no surprise. Cost-matched, time-limited, piecemeal funding programs create barriers to access for housing associations and are preventing the sort of long-term joined-up thinking that would facilitate cost-effective, neighbourhood-wide retrofit projects across Scotland. The approaches to retrofit that are mandated in energy efficiency funding schemes, the ongoing skills gap in the construction sector, and challenges with measuring and defining what good quality retrofit looks like, namely some concerns with EPCs, were also outlined in those discussions. So in order to remove the barriers that were identified, we've made several recommendations to Scottish Government. Firstly, and sort of most fundamentally, we've urged Scottish Government to overhaul the energy efficiency funding landscape. We'd like to see them combine funding into a central pot that's administered over a 5-year term and based on metrics that focus on the best outcomes for both tenants and energy performance as are reasonable given the condition of the home. We've also called for the development of a national retrofit delivery plan that considers a long-term strategy for retrofit across tenure, considering the resources, sort of both financial and human, that will be needed to deliver the vision that we have. Finally, as Scottish Government recently recognised through the establishment of their Ministerial Oversight Group on Homelessness, complex policy challenges require collaborative working. So we've therefore urged Government to create a Ministerial Oversight Group on retrofit to bring together the relevant ministers and officials to think holistically across the wider housing system and related systems. We know we're sort of asking Scottish Government to place their trust in housing associations and their ability to undertake retrofit projects efficiently, properly, and with the joint interests of the environment and their tenants in mind, but I'm not really asking them to do so blindly. This is a highly regulated sector in which housing associations are required to substantiate their expenditures, not only to their boards and the Scottish Housing Regulator, but through reporting also to Scottish Government. They're committed to the well-being of their tenants and represent effectively a wealth of untapped knowledge. They've demonstrated what they can achieve even with limited funds, and that they have the expertise to take a proactive role in achieving Scotland's net zero goals. So effectively, our report urges Scottish Government to simply give housing associations the funding that they require, step back and let them lead the way.
Okay, thanks for that, Jocelyne. I'm going to, obviously housing is a devolved power in Scotland, so it's slightly different to what we've got in England, and but I feel sure there's some lessons to be learned in relation to the Scottish experience, which both yourself and obviously Antoine will be able to reflect on, and that leads me neatly into our final speaker in this session, which is Antoine Pellet, who is head of RetrofitCredits at the social housing charity HACT. He has been leading the introduction and growth of the Retrofit Credits program, the award-winning Retrofit Credits program, since its inception in 2022. And he plays a key role in the continued development of that scheme and increasing its impact in the sector to decarbonise homes and, crucially, support the people who live in those homes. So, Antoine, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andy. And thanks to Lucy and Jocelyne for introducing your own programs, which sound really interesting. So for us, Retrofit Credits, if you haven't never heard of it, it is basically a program to be able to access additional funding for the retrofitting of homes, the decarbonisation of their homes, and as Andy mentioned, really importantly, the support of the residents who live in them to, as both said before, we've got an aging housing sector which needs a lot of work to be up to standard, and it's to support people living in more comfortable homes. And the way, so it's brought to you by HACT. As Andy said, we're a charity for the housing sector, and our partners PNZ Carbon. And to do that, to do the program, what we do is basically to verify the carbon emission reduction from retrofit works that happen across the UK. We UK wide. We don't look at any areas in particular. And what we do is we basically verify the carbon emission reduction, measure the social value impact, the positive social value impact that happens on there, and we do it in as high an integrity as possible, because what we do is we commoditize those calculations and then monetize them. And what I mean by that is that we create a carbon credit. Now, everybody knows there's been some discussions about carbon credits and what they mean and how they're utilized. So we wanted to create a program that is as high in integrity as possible. And to do that, we wanted to adhere ourselves to an internationally recognized accreditation system. And that is the Verified Carbon Standard, which we're very happy to say that we got accredited to in 2022. And on the flip side of the coin, we use the UK Social Value Bank, which is, again, a methodology for social value that is recognized and compliant to Green Book and indeed recommended by HMRC. So both of those kind of make us a high integrity program. So basically what we do is we recognize the carbon emission reduction post retrofit, post the thermal insulation upgrade and the energy intensity of homes. And basically we monetize that to bring additional funding back to landlords, which include housing associations, local authorities and other landlords across all tenureship, to be able to fund further decarbonisation at a greater scale and at a faster rate than would have been possible before it. So just to give you a few stats behind our project to date, we've verified and calculated the carbon emissions across 70,000 homes across the UK, which we calculated as an annualized carbon emission reduction of 63,000 tonnes and calculated around £36 million worth of notional social value impact to the residents who live in those 70,000 homes. The program is a long-term program. We calculate the carbon emissions across annually, and that will last until 2042 under the rules of the verified carbon standard. Some of our supporters, so some of the buyers of this the scheme to basically help the decarbonisation of homes include The Economist, Unity Trust Bank, National Grid, Trowers and Hamlins, the lawyers, Berkeley Group, the developers, and many others. And it's through their support that we can deliver more decarbonisation of homes across the UK. Thank you very much, and very happy to talk about it some more as we go through the session.
Excellent. Thanks, Antoine, for that. Just a reminder to our audience that you can post any questions for the panel in the questions box. I'm going to start off though with a question to Lucy, and that is a fairly straightforward one, really. How are you in York and North Yorkshire using place-based approaches to help in the delivery of net zero?
Yeah, so as I said, with our Routemap, it is a very place-based document with the ambition to have to get to carbon negative by 2040, and that we recognise that different interventions will work better in different places, especially because we have York as a city and then the more rural North Yorkshire. We have to get the balance right there. We also have a couple of other things as well. So we are lucky to have local area energy plans in York and North Yorkshire, which essentially, from the evidence that we had for the Routemap, that told us we need to fit this many heat pumps. We need to add this much to this. It gave us a lot of the numbers, but the local area energy plans, or the LEAPs, as I'll now refer to them, they provide us a bit more with that. What intervention, where, when, and by whom. So again, that allows us to take a very place-based approach, because we can use that information when we're looking at new funding bids, when organisations are perhaps looking at doing some of this themselves. So like if it's an industrial estate and they're thinking about putting in some solar, we can use the LEAPs to look at exactly what needs to happen in different areas. And again, that is, the local area energy plans are unique to the area that they're based on. We're also later this year developing a retrofit strategy, so that will build on a lot of the great work that we've already got in our area, but essentially just give us a bit more of a strategic direction for retrofit. But again, in our development of it, we're looking to talk to all of the different stakeholders that we have in York and North Yorkshire. So social housing will obviously be one of them, but then the supply chain as well. And that's a funny one, because our supply chain for retrofit goes outside York and North Yorkshire. We get quite a few supply chain businesses from the northeast, from West Yorkshire. So whilst it's still place-based, it's very much acknowledging that we can't do this on our own. So that document will, the development of that will be very important in terms of talking to the right people and working out what needs to happen in the different places in York and North Yorkshire. And then, yeah, as I was saying before, our one-stop shop again is unique to us. So one project that's looking at that is Retrofit One Stop Shop for York, or ROSSI as it's known at the moment, probably subject to a name change. And that is looking at creating a one-stop shop in York. And again, it's very focused on what will get consumers in York on board with this. So yeah, there are quite a few things that we're trying to do to make sure that we're looking at unique opportunities for us.
Thanks, Lucy. Just turning to Jocelyne and particularly this report that you recently worked on. I would imagine that there's quite a challenge and I'm sure Antoine can reflect on this in a moment, around retrofitting, particularly when you've got an older housing stock as well. I'm sure that's a case everywhere, including in Lucy's area as well. But from your perspective, Jocelyne, what have you found to be the biggest barriers to the wide-scale retrofit of Scotland's social housing stock?
Yeah, thanks. I think I'll say up top, social housing, registered social landlords, both housing associations and local authorities, have done a really good job thus far of meeting increasingly stringent government standards for energy efficiency. They've invested over £4 billion between 2004 and 2015 to get this work done, and as a result, have some of the most energy efficient homes in Scotland. But we still have a long way to go. So as I sort of outlined up top, the biggest challenge comes down to funding at the moment. So there are lots of things about the way that funding is administered that creates barriers even for rather robust and large housing associations, notwithstanding the much smaller community ones. Cost matching is really quite difficult. So housing associations at the moment are having to put up 50% of to match the grant funding that they're getting. There's been a very small change to policy somewhat recently, and I think this is the importance of really thinking holistically about policymaking. Previously, housing associations were allowed to blend funding programs, so they could use effectively UK level funding a lot of the time to come up with some of their 50% cost matching in order to access Scottish government level grants. There's one small change to the language when they rolled out a new program that prevented them from doing that, so it immediately decrease the accessibility for housing associations. So we'd like to see cost matching requirements sort of dispensed with. The way that funding is administered is also a really difficult problem. So it's year-to-year funding, it's not guaranteed. So that creates a litany of challenges, from the cost of preparing an application for funding. So for some of my housing associations that are larger, they've got the in-house expertise to get a grant application to the point where they can actually submit it, but that requires a lot of expertise, a lot of planning. And for housing associations that don't have that in-house expertise, that's a lot of money to put up with no guarantee that they'll get the funding in the first place. So for a lot of them, they just, and some of the quotes from the report, I'll not attempt in this very Canadian accent, but some of the quotes from my housing associations are in the report, and I love them very much. And they said things like, we can't roll the dice, we can't take that gamble. So they just opt to not even apply for funding in the first place because they can't put up the costs to get to a place where they can apply. That has a knock-on effect on some of the industry and contractors as well, because sometimes they're the ones that are sort of putting up that funding to support housing associations to get those applications to where they need to be. So that's one barrier in and of itself. Another is the amount of time that they have to get this funding. So from the time that they actually hear that presuming they put an application in, they're successful, the amount of time they have to then turn around that work is also incredibly challenging and pressurizes the entire system, the contractors, and the tenants as well. The housing associations, I am in awe of them and how considerate they are of their tenants' needs. And it sort of prevents them from being able to communicate effectively with tenants, tell them what's coming, decant tenants where necessary in a helpful way, in a non-disruptive way. And then it also pressurizes the industry to turn around work really, really quickly, and which undermines quality and all of those things. So that's a challenge. The amount of administration that comes with these things is also a challenge. Housing associations felt like they were really removed from decision makers. They just wanted to pick up the phone and have a conversation with somebody. As I alluded to, there's sort of wider systems level issues. A skills gap in construction in Scotland is a real problem, in particular, sort of as Lucy alluded to, in remote and rural areas. Finding the people that you need in Scotland in construction is a challenge at the best of times. Finding them on an island is immensely challenging. We also have challenges in terms of the way that we're measuring and sort of quantifying and qualifying what good retrofit looks like. So EPCs are somewhat problematic. We've had that conversation in many different forums in Scotland, and I'm sure it's happening across the UK. The way we measure EPCs is problematic. The cost of getting EPC certificates is a challenge. The amount of reassessments that are needed due to errors is a challenge. And it completely disregards what's best for tenants and what their sort of quality metrics are saying. So I think there are lots of challenges. Primarily, it comes down to funding, but there are also sort of things in terms of administration and the time constraints that we're working under effectively that prevent what we would like to see, which is very long-term, neighborhood-wide, cross-tenure approaches to the way we undertake retrofit. It's way cheaper for everybody if we can take a look at a particular neighborhood or an estate and say, regardless of tenure, let's try to do the best we can for this particular neighborhood. So there are lots of barriers, and primarily comes down to funding, but there are other sort of system-wide pieces we need to consider as well.
I'm going to explore the funding issue in a little bit more detail later. But it's interesting, something, well, a lot of what you were saying there, comparing it to some of the conversations we had yesterday about different issues, albeit in the whole sustainability area. What comes through loud and clear is the need for a more joined up approach, the need for a more holistic approach across the board, not just looking at specific areas, but how do they all fit together? How do they link together? How do you take account of different areas of work, of programs of activity, in order to actually then truly move towards economies of scale, enabling people to do what needs to be done? And I think, again, it'll be interesting a bit later to explore whether, notwithstanding the fact that you've got a devolved approach to the housing area, whether the recent change of government might actually loosen some purse strings elsewhere, in relation to the overall economy. We'll explore that in a minute. I just want to bring Antoine in, though, about his retrofit credits scheme. How does that actually work, and what do organisations need to do practically to benefit from that scheme?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mandy, and really interesting to hear Jocelyne's views on the challenges that are in the sector, and we hear exactly the same. One way that retrofit credits can help is that it bolts on to anything that people can do. So we're not competitive. We can accept any kind of work. So as long as it has additionality both to the environment and to the inhabitants of that home, we can credit for it. So the way we do it is by measuring the baseline level of a home. We measure what single or multiple measures are installed in that home, and that can be anything that can be measurable, from thermal insulation, so loft, cavity wall, exterior wall, etc., etc. It can be change of heating systems, so even an upgrade from solid fuel to gas, or even upgrade of gas, and of course what we all want to get to, the electrification of homes and getting away from fossil fuel, of course, but that's not always possible in every home. So and the additionality of like solar panels, these kind of methods, anything that can really increase the thermal efficiency or decrease the energy intensity of that home, we can measure and verify and then quantify. So what we do is we take the baseline level of the home, we take the post retrofit calculations of that home, and then that difference in energy use gives us a carbon emission reduction. We also couple that with weather patterns, postcode weather patterns for that particular area. So the colder it is, the more high intensity you have in carbon emission reduction, etc. So, and then we measure that in arrears on a daily basis. So it actually measures real time and robust carbon emission reductions. And then we couple that with the social value. So what the UK Social Value Bank does is look at specific social value pieces. So the well-being of people, health impact on a person, environmental impact, and exchequer savings, so the savings to the state. And we look at that and we put those calculations together in a notional pound figure, because everybody understands the value of a pound, £10, £100, etc. And we couple that on an annual basis. So for every ton of carbon emission reduction, there is approximately a £600 social value piece that comes with it, and that can be monetized on a yearly basis. So basically that creates one credit, and that credit can be sold every year until the end of our projects. Now, under the internationally recognized verified carbon standard, our project is allowed to monetize the value of the carbon saved up to 2042 included, which means that there is a long-term potential generating funds to be able to come back to housing associations, local authorities, landlords, to be able to fund more work. So what we found is it's not silver bullet as such, but over the lifetime of the period of the project, it should cost mitigate or generate the funding against around 15 to 20% of the total cost of the retrofit measure over the lifetime. So it's an absolute. If somebody came up to you and said, "Well, over the next 19 years, we'll be able to generate 20% of the cost of your retrofit at no cost, because there's no cost to the providers, and also there's no competition. You can just give us your data, we'll do the verifications, have it independently audited, sell the credits, and give you the funding back." I think most people would go, "Well, where's the catch? You know, it sounds too good to be true," which I've had on many of my calls. But basically, that's the way it works.
Okay, thanks, Antoine, for that. I just want to turn back to Lucy. You're obviously part of a combined authority. How do you think that devolution can accelerate the delivery of net zero across cities and regions? And also, I'm not asking you to be political in any way here, because I know these things can be sensitive for people in local authorities. But do you think the result of last Thursday's general election might change anything going forward in terms of what you're doing, the funding, infrastructure, and everything else? And I'm going to come back and ask Jocelyne and Antoine about that as well in a second. But first of all, yourself, Lucy, on that. The devolution aspect and also the election.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So obviously devolution is a massive opportunity for us. Our devolution deal was built around, and one of the foundations of it was our ambition to get to carbon negative, again, because it's kind of our USP for the region and something that makes us different. So I think that puts us in quite a strong position. I think the main things really are that devolution, obviously, cash comes with it to some extent, in a way that it doesn't outside of that. So we've already had our net zero fund, which was £7 million. That was part of our initial devolution deal. So that's now going out to various projects across the region. But obviously we're hopeful that that kind of funding will continue, and that we'll be able to have competitions and things across different areas of net zero. But I think the other thing that is sort of coming through devolution is that we're getting a lot more interest in other projects, because we're quite a new combined authority. We haven't got everything set in stone yet, so we have that ability to be able to have a bit of a play around with different concepts and pilot things. So we're also working on a project to look at whether the Bristol City Leap model could be replicated in our region, and that's another thing that's come about during our devolution process. In terms of the general election, obviously it is a bit political, but I think mainly we obviously, our mayor, David Scaife, was the Labour candidate. So obviously now he is in that position where he is the same party as the government. So that obviously will have benefits. And he was in London yesterday with all of the other mayors. So hopefully there's lots of room for collaboration there. And I think that's the other thing, is that sort of direct line with government. And that is something that I'm keen to incorporate in our retrofit strategy as we develop that later this year, is to make use of that to communicate the challenges that we have as a local area trying to do retrofit, like Jocelyne was mentioning, around like capacity and all those kinds of things, and also to seek further opportunities. And I think that overall devolution presents us with more of an opportunity to do that, to look for whether that's funding or capacity, or generally just being able to share everything that we're doing with a wider audience. So I think it's a big opportunity for us.
Thanks very much, Lucy. Again, a kind of a similar question, and it may be a short answer, or it might not be. But Jocelyne first, are you expecting any changes of emphasis or whatever as a result of the general election. I mean, clearly there was a big vote in Scotland for Labour, and Labour won the election. So presumably people were doing that for a reason. Whether or not that's a reason that actually filters down into this sector, well, maybe you can tell me. What's your thoughts on that?
I'm going to mirror Lucy in being quite careful and possibly sidestepping part of that question in terms of what the results in Scotland mean. I think I'll start by saying the CIOB, my colleagues who are operating at a UK level and at Westminster, have made several calls to the new Labour government. We had a manifesto ahead of the election, so I will direct participants there if they're quite keen to see what the CIOB as an institution is calling for. What I'll also say and remind people of, because I do sense there's been some confusion, is we've not had a change of government in Scotland. Holyrood's not different. So I am continuing forward with the same First Minister and Cabinet that I had. To some people that will be quite obvious, but it's become apparent to me that not everybody is aware of that. So those caveats sort of out of the way, I think, as Lucy alluded to, devolution in terms of housing is an opportunity. Scotland's housing system works differently to England in particular. Our relationship to social housing and some of the policies in particular around homelessness and statutory requirements for local authorities and the role that social housing plays in those homelessness pieces of legislation is different. I think there are some matters that are retained that will have an impact on housing in Scotland, whether directly or indirectly. Retained matters like immigration will have an impact on the skills shortage in Scotland, for instance. And I'll not say anything other than just saying that is a retained matter and it will have an indirect impact on housing in Scotland. I am conscious of some calls that exist within Scotland for changes at Westminster level in relation to things like borrowing powers for housing for our housing minister in Scotland. We've had some decreases to block grant funding in Scotland, and I know that never makes anything easier in terms of the amount of funding we have for affordable housing investment. We've seen some cuts to the budget at Scottish Government level, and I know colleagues have been really strongly advocating for a reversal to those cuts. So basically, this is maybe a bit of a cop-out answer, but I think we have a housing system in Scotland. I would like to, as you've alluded to, Andy, see much more holistic thinking across that system and related systems. There are some calls to changes that we'd like to see at Westminster, both at a CIOB level and just more broadly in terms of what policy change might make a positive impact here in Scotland. But yes, I think I've sidestepped your question, but suffice it to say, we've got a Scottish housing system. I'd like to think holistically across that system, and there are some key changes at Westminster that could help support positive investment in that system.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I appreciate, obviously, given the fact that it is devolved, and also that, you're a little bit circumspect about what you want to say. I think, as someone who looks at these things in the round, I'm quite interested in the politics of all of this, because actually, if you think about it, I mean, obviously, the next Scottish Parliament elections are not until May 2026, but nevertheless, I'm sure that the governing party in Scotland will be looking over its shoulder, given the results last Thursday, and thinking, well, actually, we need to make sure that we do the best that we can to retain support going forward. And that may or may not affect policies in a whole series of areas, one of which could be housing. So I think, notwithstanding the fact that it is a devolved issue, if you like, what's happening in the UK Parliament, if I can call it that, then can have an effect on what might be developing in terms of the Scottish political scene as well. Again, I don't know whether I'm going to get the same reply from Antoine, but I'll ask the question anyway. But I've got other questions as well. I mean, do you think there will be any changes as a result of the change in the overall, in inverted commas, national, because I know national in your context means Scotland, supranational sort of environment? And also, just generally speaking, from your scheme as well, are you confident that there will be enough funding available for that scheme going forward?
So we're completely apolitical, being a charity, as you probably guessed. So we just welcome any party or any government that puts more funding into the decarbonisation of the built environment. As we all know, the UK has some of the oldest housing stock. some of the least energy efficient stock. It's going to take, for all housing to be net zero, it's going to take over £300 billion. Now, no government is going to be able to pay for all of that. So, that's why retrofit credits is here. It's part of an innovative scheme to be able to raise more finance from private sector to bring into the housing sector and other built environment. Our program is looking to go broader as well. Next year, we're going to bring out the methodology that looks at the decarbonisation of non-residential buildings. So that'll be also kind of a social piece. So schools, hospitals, museums, civic centres, all of that kind of good work that's happening there. But basically, any funding that can come, extra funding that can come into the pot to help people living more comfortable homes, because we all know that the rippling effect and the good positive effect that come from living in comfortable homes is vastly sort of out costs the actual cost, because the savings to the NHS, the savings to education from kids having a proper home to live in. I mean, one of the stories I heard was, from the cost of living and from having poor homes, the children having to do their homework under their duvets, and we're the sixth richest country in the world, apparently. So, all of that stuff. So yes, the Labour government which have come in, have said that there'll be more long-term potential in terms of grants and funding. That's a good thing, as Lucy and Jocelyne mentioned. These pepper pot sort of yearly funding schemes don't really help anybody. They don't help in green skills. They don't help for the future of any programs. So more long term, and whatever positives can come from that, we very much welcome. And also, to echo what Lucy and Jocelyne say, more local pieces. Our project is really geared for having supporters that come from the same areas that works are happening, and having a joint, virtuous, local, circular model. That's what it's all about. I hope that answers part of your question. I kind of dodged it as well a little bit.
No, that that that's absolutely fine. I just want to return to Lucy for a second, and that is to ask a particular question around. Obviously, Antoine's been talking about retrofit credits, mainly a scheme for the social housing sector. Are you using any similar schemes, or is there any scope within the private sector to also tap into that kind of funding?
Yeah, so with our one-stop shop project, we do have a finance work stream within that, looking at the possibilities that we might be able to offer something within the one-stop shop, because we know that finance is one of the barriers to people wanting to retrofit their homes. So I think it's quite a complex issue. Again, we're also looking at the Bristol City Leap model and how that might relate to York and North Yorkshire. So I think in a number of projects, we're looking at finance within that and seeing what options there are. I think obviously the issue with finance from a local authority perspective, and speaking not just for ourselves, but also with North Yorkshire Council and City of York Council, our two constituent councils, there's obviously an amount of risk to take on as a local authority, which I think is different compared to when we're talking about social housing. We're talking about their own stock. It's, investing into their own stock, whereas with the private market, that's a bit more complicated. But it's something that we're exploring, whether it would be loans that have a much lower interest, or whether there are other schemes that we can use. But I think it's one of the biggest barriers for us to overcome. Although interestingly, some of the research that we've done in our area, looking at what prevents people from doing retrofit, some of it is obviously finance comes out as one of them, but one of the other ones that we're really trying to tackle through the one-stop shop is not recognizing a brand. So when people go and buy a new car, they know they can buy a Mazda or a Honda, or other brands are available, but they can buy whenever they want, and they know that if they go to any garage anywhere in the world, potentially they'll be able to get parts for that car that's branded in that way, whereas retrofit doesn't have that yet. So I think that we need to unlock some more finance options, as well as all of the other barriers, because I think if we only offer finance options, that won't actually be enough to get people to retrofit their homes. So yeah, a bit of a puzzle piece situation, I think.
Thanks, Lucy. Just going back to Jocelyne, in your view, practically, and hopefully this is one that you can answer, what can the Scottish Government do to support the wide-scale retrofit and energy efficiency upgrades to Scotland's social housing stock, in your view?
Sorry, I've lost you all for a second. Can you give me that question again?
Yeah, I'll give you that again. Yeah, basically, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now. I'm back.
What I said was, what practically can the Scottish Government do to support the wide-scale retrofit and energy efficiency upgrades that Scotland's social housing stock needs?
Effectively, the most immediate thing is to completely overhaul the funding landscape in the way that we've outlined in the paper. So central pot of funding over the 5-year term, get rid of cost matching and applied sort of based on need. We've also given some recommendations in terms of how the government might then go about allocating funding, because if we make access much easier, there won't be enough to go around. So we've made some recommendations in terms of mapping and triaging social housing stock as well. I'd also like to see a national retrofit delivery plan that looks not only at finance, but human resource, and brings in, via a ministerial oversight group on retrofit, all of the other relevant systems and ministers to look at things like further and higher education, community finance, the climate action minister, so we can think really holistically across Scotland's entire housing system and the related systems that feed into it.
Okay, thanks. And also looking at the bigger picture here, I mean, obviously, carbon is a huge driver for retrofit, but what about the wider environmental and economic cost of materials? You know, that has an effect as well. Now, I know that yourselves, Jocelyne, have been looking at those wider implications as well. I mean, how do you capture those benefits? And also, after you answer that, maybe if Antoine as well can reflect on, I know social value is really important to what you do, and just reflect on how that relates to this whole area, and how we can actually, you know, pull out and present the benefits of that as a result of all of this. So Jocelyne first, Antoine, and then I've got a final question for Lucy up my sleeve. So Jocelyne first.
Yeah, I'm conscious of time. So effectively, this is why I'd like to see sort of a holistic systems-wide consideration, so that we can look at not only the materials we use and the benefits that they have, and how we can maximize those things, but to the points that Antoine sort of raised, how we can use housing to achieve a just transition in some of our social equity goals, in terms of things like fuel poverty, obviously, is a huge component part of why we ought to be retrofitting homes, and making sure that we're achieving not only environmental benefit, but also social benefit through housing. So I think it's sort of the approach and the way we look at these things is sort of retrofitting housing as a tool to achieve some of our other objectives, both in terms of environmental benefit, but also social benefit as well.
Jocelyne,
Yeah,
thank you for
very much.
being brief. Again, briefly, Antoine, on the social value issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you intimated, carbon is kind of the key, but actually, why are we doing it? You know, it's for people. So really, it's the social aspect. It's measuring or humanizing the science, and that's what we try and do with our retrofit credit, is to measure the impact on local communities, on people that have had their homes retrofitted. So once we look at the carbon emission reduction, yeah, that's great. But actually, it's all the rippling positive effects that come from that are actually the most important. So it's sometimes reversing the whole thing and looking at what's good for people, and then, oh, what's good for people is actually good for the environment in this case.
Thanks very much, Antoine. And just finally, Lucy, I know that a lot of what you do, and there's some fantastic initiatives, that that you guys are doing in North Yorkshire. You're obviously having to work with the private sector, on quite a wide scale. How are you finding that? And are they receptive? And are they helpful in relation to what you need to do?
Yeah, so speaking just in terms of retrofit, one of the pieces of work that I'm doing is leading a network, so the York Retrofit Network, to try and engage with our supply chain and let them know here's all the work that we need to do if we want to hit the targets we have, and we need you to do that, and giving them a bit of confidence. So that has been really interesting because they've been very receptive to that, and we've had a lot of engagement with them, and essentially a lot of what they've said is we're really glad to see that you're engaging with us, and they have a lot of useful information for us in terms of what we can do to further support them, and how we can best integrate them into the process. So from that perspective, it's been really useful to talk to private businesses of multiple sizes as well. We have a lot of small businesses on our patch, and we're keen to include them. So yeah, it's been a really good, a positive experience, I would say, and we've gotten a lot out of it, and I hope they've gotten a lot out of it as well.
Great. We've run out of time, as we always do on these occasions, because time is a finite concept. I'd just like to thank all of you for being here this morning in this session, and to thank everybody who's been listening and watching as well. So thanks to Lucy Allis from York and North Yorkshire Combined Authority, to Jocelyne Fleming from the Chartered Institute of Building in Scotland, and also to Antoine Pellet from the social housing charity HACT. And if you want more information on all of the great initiatives that all of those organisations are doing, then basically just put their organisations into Google and you'll get all sorts of stuff that comes out. But thanks very much for taking part in this session in Net Zero Week. We've got another session coming up in around about 10 minutes time, where we'll be looking at reimagining urban landscapes, no less. So again, continuing that theme of place. But for now, it's goodbye from me, Andy Walker, and goodbye from Jocelyne, Lucy, and Antoine. Thanks very much.
Bye.
Thank you.